Good morning, and happy Father's Day to those of you to whom it applies. And in thinking of Father's Day, probably the most stereotypical gift that one would get or give for Father's Day is a mug, maybe a t-shirt that says "World's Best Father." This morning, just to be ironic perhaps, instead of thinking about the world's best father, which in spiritual terms would be God the Father, but we want to take a moment to look at the world's worst father. And so if you got that mug this morning, I'm sorry about that, but hopefully you didn't. But in biblical terms, who would be the world's worst father? And there are a few contenders for it, but we'll start out with one that I think probably does take the cake. And then after that, we'll look at somebody who's not quite as bad, then somebody that you would think would do pretty well, but doesn't turn out all that well in the end. And so we're going to take a look at this, but you also might ask, well, why look at the worst fathers on Father's Day, a day that's supposed to be honoring those who are in this role? And the sad reality is that the majority of fathers presented in the Bible are not worth imitating. The majority of them, especially think to the book of Kings and 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, the majority of them aren't really that great at all. And so we'll start in 2 Kings chapter 16. We'll take a look there. And one father in particular that really does deserve the mug of world's worst father is King Ahaz. Not Ahab, that's a different guy who probably also deserves the mug. But in this case, King Ahaz, chapter 16 of 2 Kings, starting in verse 1, it tells his story this way. It says, in the 17th year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, Ahaz, the son of Jotham, by the way, Jotham was actually a pretty good king of Judah, began to reign. So Ahaz begins to reign. Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king. And he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, and he did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord, as his father David had done. Now, just to clarify, David is not his actual father. Jotham is his father. David is his ancestor farther back in the line. But the writer there uses the term father to mean someone that is in his ancestry. But the way it's phrased in verse 2 is a pretty bad understatement to say that he did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord his God. He did the opposite of that. He spent 16 years making every mistake someone could make, and in fact being the world's worst father. Now, how do I know that? Well, let's read verse 3. In verse 3 it says, but he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. Indeed, he made his son pass through the fire according to the abominations of the nations, whom the Lord had cast out from before the children of Israel. And in addition to that, he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places, on the hills, and under every green tree. Okay, so what's being meant here? Let's start with verse 4, actually, to say that what Ahaz is doing is pagan worship. So he's supposed to be worshiping the God that created the universe, the God that the Jews know. And instead, what he does is he worships every other god. And he worships on altars that the Lord hasn't authorized. He worships in places apart from the temple. And so he is worshiping false gods, left and right. But then he takes on one more practice from the nation around him, or the nations around him. He makes his son pass through the fire. Now, there is some debate as to exactly what this means, but it's almost certain, and most scholars will agree, that this is literal and that it's not meant to test the child, but is meant to kill the child. And so what we would call this is human sacrifice. And so what Ahaz is doing is he is offering his children as burnt offerings to false gods. Now, I don't know how bad of a father you are, but have you ever done that? Hopefully you're at least a step above that point. And so Ahaz, by this alone, would definitely deserve the title of the world's worst father. Aside from this, he gets more involved in pagan worship, and you can read on in the rest of this chapter. You'll see more about it, but he would sacrifice to these pagan gods. He would even build an altar that was designed after a pagan altar. That's down around verse 10 in this chapter. And he would essentially board up the temple and prevent worship from happening there. So it wasn't enough that he worshiped false gods. He didn't even want people to worship the true God. And so all these things put together make him the world's worst father, certainly the world's worst king as well, of the nation of Judah at this point. And so you wouldn't want to be him as a father. You probably wouldn't want to be him on the day of judgment either. The life that he lived was in direct opposition to God. The role that he played as a father was anything but a father. Now, not all of his children were killed in this way. It may just be that his first child was, because he does have a son that we'll talk about a little bit later on. The second person that we want to talk about, though, and this is from the text that was read for us in 1 Samuel chapter 2, and verse 12 is where we'll look first. 1 Samuel 2, verse 12 says, "Now the sons of Eli were corrupt. They did not know the Lord." Well, that's simple enough. But who are we talking about? Well, in the verse before this, it mentions that Eli is the priest of the Lord. And so Eli is supposed to be the one offering sacrifices to God, the one that is sort of intervening between God and the people of Israel. And he does this okay, it seems, but his children that he's raised are terrible. And they are. By all accounts, they're worthless. And so they are detailed in the following verses here, verses 13 down through 17, that they would take the offerings that were supposed to go to God, and they would have people offer them incorrectly in the first place. They would tell them to do this incorrectly so that they could get more from it, so that they could take more of the meat from the animals that were being sacrificed to God. So that means you're stealing from people, and it means you're stealing from God. Well, that's pretty bad, but why did that happen? Why did it ever become that the sons of the priest were this wicked and were allowed to serve in the role of priest when they obviously should not be, based on their character or lack of character? In verse 17, it specifies a little bit more that, verse 17, "Therefore the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord." And so it was making the offering to God completely incorrect and sinful in and of itself because it wasn't according to what God wanted. And the men responsible, that is the sons of Eli, were committing a great sin as well. But again, why does this happen? Well, the first answer we already read. In verse 12 it says, "Because they did not know the Lord." Now, if children don't know the Lord, whose fault primarily is that? According to the Bible, it is the responsibility of the parents, not just the father on Father's Day, but the mother and father to pass on that faith to their children. Now, obviously, the child has a choice, and sometimes children will make a choice well after they have been taught something. But it is the responsibility of Eli in this situation to make sure that his children do better than this. Later on in this chapter, God is going to condemn Eli. He's going to do so starting verse 27. But look at verse 29. The question is asked of Eli. It says, "Why do you kick at my sacrifice, or go against my sacrifice, and my offering, which I have commanded in my dwelling place? And why do you honor your sons more than me, to make yourselves fat with the best of all the offerings of Israel, my people?" There's two problems going on here for Eli. Number one, he never taught his children to know the Lord. Well, that's a problem in and of itself. The second problem that might explain that first problem, is that he honored his own sons more than he honored God. Anytime that happens, the results are going to be less than ideal. So they were going to be wicked sons, not just that, but he would let them play the role of priest where they wouldn't just hurt themselves, but they would hurt others and mislead others as they tried to sacrifice to God, and they would teach them to do incorrectly as they had done as well. And Eli, for his part, he overlooks this behavior, and he raised these two sons to be what they were. And whether that's out of neglect or whether that's out of bad teaching on his part, those are the results. The third father and we'll just talk about him for a minute because we've talked about him quite a bit over the last few weeks in the adult class on Sunday mornings. The other father worth mentioning here is David. Now, David, if you're talking about the world's worst fathers, probably doesn't immediately come to mind, especially given the description that he has of being a man after God's own heart, as being among the greatest kings of Israel, as being a direct ancestor to God's own son coming into the world. And in spite of all those things, he's kind of a so-so father. He really doesn't have the best track record when we look at his sons. We've talked about a couple of them already. We've talked about Amnon. That didn't go so well. We've talked about Absalom this morning. I imagine we'll talk a little bit about Adonijah at some point. Those latter two sons that we just mentioned both tried to take the throne from their own father. And so even if you look to Solomon as the best son of David, he still has his own problems. But it's evident from the life of David that somehow, just as in the case of Eli, even if he was a better person and of more upstanding character than Eli or Ahaz, that something went wrong. From David to his children, somehow they, by and large, did not know the Lord. Now, probably the simplest explanation for David's life is just to look at David's life. At what point in David's life is he not at war with some other nation? Most of his life is spent fighting. If it's not spent fighting, then it's spent when he is on the run, whether that be from his own children who are trying to take his throne, or he's on the run from Saul for a long portion of his life, even once he has children, or he spent time in hiding again for those same reasons, or he was focused on building projects like he was toward the end of his life, getting ready to prepare the temple for Solomon, his son, to build. And besides that, whatever else a king has to do day to day in order to keep a kingdom running. And so when we look at David's life, what's the problem? Is it that he wasn't a man of God? He certainly was. Does that matter if he's never there? Does it really matter how good of a father or a person you are if as a father you aren't present? Well, let's take these three examples and draw some more specific applications from them. So again, these three fathers who in one sense are quite different from another, but in another way they kind of all have the same problem. But specific to each one, what do we get from Ahaz when we look at him? Well, Ahaz is just a terrible person, start to finish. He's a terrible king, and he's a terrible father. And I don't think any of that's unfair given what we have recorded for us in the biblical record. He came from a pretty decent king, a pretty decent father, and yet he chose to act differently. But the best lesson maybe from him is simply to do better than that. And especially if you come from a better background, then don't introduce negative things. But the other thing we might say with Ahaz is this: don't let the influences outside of your household impact the way that you deal with your own family. And so in this case, it's a little bit extreme. But with Ahaz, what we're really talking about is he saw the nations around him and the way that they worshiped their gods. And he said, okay, yeah, maybe I can get something out of that. And I won't worship the God of my ancestors anymore. I'll worship these gods. And if they say that I need to sacrifice my children, okay, that's what I'll do too. And again, it may not be that today, but if you look at the world, there's plenty of examples of things that we don't want to bring into our own families. And so the question will be, as a father, as a parent, how do we respond to this? Do we rise above? Do we teach our children not to become entangled in the things of the world? Or do we allow those influences to come in? Second father that we talked about, of course, is Eli. Now with Eli, the problem is a little bit different, but maybe the best lesson from Eli, aside from teaching your children to know the Lord, which he failed to do, is to not ignore bad behavior. And so Eli had the opportunity at some point to correct any of these things that were going on. And instead, he lets it go. And instead, what we have is his sons becoming the priest and him allowing them to steal from the people and to steal from God. He could have done better. He could have stopped it. And instead, he chooses to ignore the things that are going on. Aside from failing to train them to follow in his footsteps, he allows all these other improper behaviors to go on until really it's too late. And of course, all that starts with putting his children before God, having those priorities out of order. Now, there is, of course, in parenting a certain amount of freedom that has to be given. And there's room to say, well, children do have to find out some things for themselves. But let me suggest a few phrases that Eli may have used that you might hear some parents make today. Eli may have said of his own children that they're taking their own path. Maybe. Did they take their own path? They certainly did. But you'll hear a lot of parents say that same kind of idea today, or say, well, I don't want to push them to do fill in the blank. I don't want to push them too far or too hard in this direction. Okay? Maybe Eli said that they have to learn for themselves. Well, they did. And we see what they learned. These phrases, again, sometimes if they're meant in the right way, just mean that children need a little bit of space. But on the other hand, they can be used all too often as an excuse that really is just a synonym for saying, I saw that my children were struggling. I saw that my children were headed in the wrong direction, and I chose not to help them. If we want to take a hands-off approach to parenting, as is becoming probably more popular today, then we probably would do well to look at an example of what hands-off parenting looks like and what the result ends up being. The result here is that Eli is remembered as not being a great father, but more importantly than that his sons turned out wicked and that God killed his sons almost in front of his eyes as a punishment for all of this behavior that had gone on. And so probably not the best example to follow. The third person, again, that we talked about is David. And the example from David, or the lesson from David, is simple enough, which is to be there. If David were there whenever all of these events were taking place that we've mentioned, and especially that we've mentioned over the last few weeks in our Sunday morning class, then maybe things would be a little bit different. But ultimately, it doesn't matter if you are a man after God's own heart, if your children aren't able to ever see that because you aren't with them or you aren't telling them directly, you aren't teaching them the things that they need to know. With all of these children that come from these people, in one sense, you would say that they were successful, at least in an earthly sense, right? After all, the son of Ahaz will be a king, right? The sons of David are princes, they're kings. By earthly standards, that's pretty good. Even the sons of Eli, while they weren't kings, they were the priests of a whole nation. Is that pretty impressive? Well, sure. How much does that matter? How much does that benefit them spiritually? And so while we can have success in earthly terms, none of that's really going to matter if the one thing is missed out on that's specified about the sons of Eli, which is that they did not know God. And so whether you're talking about Ahaz, who offered his children as burnt offerings to false gods, or whether you're talking about David, who just wasn't there enough, what's the same about them? What's the common denominator? One way or another, these fathers failed to teach their children about God. If you want to know what the world's worst father looks like, that's really all it takes. Even if they do great in the rest of the parenting world, even if they set their children up for success in worldly things, if their children do not know the Lord, then what does the rest of it matter? The positive side of this, and especially in these examples, is that these past failures, and even your past failures as a parent, as a Christian in relationship to God, whatever relationship it is you're talking about, past failure does not have to define what can happen in the future. It's not a death sentence. It's not over until it's over. And so in this case, we see Ahaz, he's a failure, right? He's a failure as a king. He's a failure as a father, certainly. Who's the son of Ahaz? The son of Ahaz is King Hezekiah. You remember him as one of the greatest kings of Israel? even in spite of his father, he became something great. Sometimes it takes the influence of others, perhaps, to set our children up for success. Sometimes it's in spite of us, but there is some hope there. Certainly, the sons of Eli ended up wicked, and they ended up dead as a result of his actions. But who could properly be called the adoptive son of Eli? What person did he raise from the time that he was 1 or 2 years old in the temple? Well, that would be the prophet Samuel, right? And so just because he raised 2 wicked sons, he had enough of a positive influence on Samuel that he turned out okay, although he would follow in the example of Eli in raising a couple more wicked sons. And then, of course, looking to David, we say again, yes, some of his sons ended up pretty bad, and even Solomon had his flaws, but he was still the wisest man to ever live. And he still wrote a couple of parts of the Bible that we still read today. And eventually, through the line of David, we have the Messiah come into the world. Eventually, through that line, which, let me remind you, is not just the line of King David, the one that kind of neglected his family in favor of the things that he was doing as king, but even King Ahaz is in the line that Jesus comes through eventually. He is an ancestor to the Christ when he came into the world. Ahaz, the one that killed some of his own children. Ahaz, the one that worshiped false gods. God still eventually used his lineage for good. This morning, the message is hopefully simple and simply understood, but perhaps we can say this, that God does not require perfect fathers, which is good for all of us, but he does require fathers that are present and fathers that are willing to teach their children to know the Lord. Same thing could be said in a more general sense as a way of invitation this morning, that God does not require perfect people. He does not require perfect Christians, but he does require them to be faithful, and he does require them to be obedient. And this morning is an opportunity for you. If you've never been obedient to God, this is a time to do so. If you have questions, we would like to help you find the answers. If you have needs, we'd like to help you address them. If there's anything that we can do, or if you need to respond to the invitation of God, now's your chance as we stand and as we sing.